to say there are two very short videos in the middle, so fingers crossed they will work. We've practiced and they work. So anyway, thank you so much for the invite, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here today and to talk about the Renal Arts Group. It's an example of an initiative that started off as a very small acorn and has grown over time. And I don't know if there's any early career researchers here or PhD students, but it's an example of something that worked just by allowing it to grow very, very slowly, and just by putting one foot in front of the other and just going with our intuition. So I hope you can see it as an example of that, and maybe think about how something like this might be useful in your own work. So we've got about an hour, and I'm going to present for about 20 minutes, and then I'm going to hand over to Claire Carswell, who you will all know, for the following 20 minutes, and then we'll have some time for discussion. I want to acknowledge Anna Wilson, who wasn't able to be part of this today. She's our administrator, and she plays a huge role in the Renal Arts Group, and it's very unfortunate she can't contribute, and I will talk a little bit more about her later. Okay, so Claire, if you could just move on. So before we start, I just want to talk a little bit about kidney disease for those of you who don't know much about this chronic illness. It is an awful chronic illness, and these patients are very under-recognised, partly because they're just a much smaller population than perhaps those with heart disease or cancer. But chronic kidney disease is on the rise because the leading cause of chronic kidney disease is diabetes, and we know that diabetes is increasing. So end-stage kidney disease is the final stage of chronic kidney disease. So people can have chronic kidney disease for many years and deteriorate slowly to end-stage kidney disease, and some people will present acutely with end-stage kidney disease and require treatment immediately. It's once you have it, it's lifelong, and there is absolutely no cure. So to treat end-stage kidney disease, when the kidneys stop working, we use renal replacement therapy, and ideally the gold standard is a kidney transplant. That's not without problems, but when people get kidney transplants, it's very, very helpful in terms of their quality of life. But many people won't get a transplant because they're older with lots of comorbidity. They might not be good matches for the kidneys that come along, and so some people end up on dialysis, long-term dialysis. And the most common form of dialysis is in-hospital hemodialysis, where you come up to hospital 3 times a week and you go onto a hemodialysis machine for 4 hours at each visit. So if you have a little look at this little picture, and Claire, you might be able to put the cursor over where I'm going to describe. So people come up into the renal unit, and you have these you have needles put into what's called a fistula, and blood is removed from the body and is taken around the dialysis machine into the artificial kidney. The blood is filtered and then it's returned to the patient. So if you just put yourself into that position and having to go through that on one occasion, that'd be pretty traumatic and awful. But these patients have to come up repetitively 3 times a week for often the rest of their lives. And when they come, they're restricted to a bed or a chair for 4 hours, and it's terribly tedious. A lot of patients just sleep the whole way through, and as you might imagine, there's an awful lot of depression and anxiety in this group and other mental health problems and conditions. And what we know, and what you will all know, is depression and anxiety reduces quality of life, and it also increases morbidity and mortality. And depression is an independent predictor of mortality in hemodialysis patients. So if you've got depression, you are more likely to die. There's a lot of reduced treatment adherence in our population. They have to adhere to very strict medication regimes to manage all these symptoms that arise because of the kidney failure. We are starting to recognise that they often have as many or more symptoms than people with cancer. They have to follow really strict dietary regimes, just simple things like keeping potassium down, so you have to reduce numbers of bananas, you can't eat tomatoes. there's a really strict regime, and we work closely with dietitians. And then there's a really strict fluid regime as well. So patients are usually on a restriction of 500 mils of fluid a day, and many patients don't adhere to that because it's really difficult. That's about 2 cups of tea, and within that you have to include soup and custard and jelly, etc. So this is a condition that you wouldn't wish on anyone, really. So that's just a summary of kidney disease. Then I'll move on, Claire, to the next slide. So the renal arts group. So how did that begin? I have always worked quite closely with patients and carers, and one patient I've worked very closely with is William Johnston, and William had been on hemodialysis for 17 years. So he'd been coming up to the unit for 17 years, 3 times a week. He's had been transplanted since, which is great. But he went right down through the depths of depression to the point of being suicidal. And in order to manage his very difficult emotions, he started to write poetry whilst he was on dialysis and some plays. And he felt that that would help express these emotions, help him to communicate perhaps more effectively with healthcare staff. Dialysis units, if you know them, they're units where there's a kind of conveyor belt feeling where patients come in the morning, they line up, they go on these machines, they're on for 4 hours, then they come off and they run out of the unit, they can't wait to get home. But sometimes there can be a little bit of a breakdown in communication between patients and carers and understanding of what this experience is really like. The other thing was it really helped to pass the time whilst on dialysis, because one of the things Claire talks about in her PhD is this existential boredom that occurs where patients just find it so tedious and draining being on dialysis for this length of time, week in and week out. So I didn't know what to do. Sorry. So next, what happened was I didn't know what to do with this book of poetry that William had given me. And the first thing I did was go and see a professor of English at Queen's. And she didn't really know what to do with this book of poetry either. And I suppose what I'm trying to say here is that, these things happen in life and happen in your career, and you just kind of go with your instinct and your intuition. And I would really recommend that, because even if you go down a blind alley and you come out, nothing's ever lost. Because when I went to see that professor, she put me in touch with Jenny Baxley Lee, who's from the Center of Arts in Medicine at the University of Florida, and she was looking to do her PhD at the time. And she's become a really valued member of the Renal Arts Group. And we were really lucky for Claire to gain some funding and go and spend some time with Jenny at the Centre for Arts during her PhD. So although the professor in English wasn't able to help, we were able to make a really good collaboration. So in 2016, we decided that we didn't really know what to do with this book of poetry, so why not bring some people together to see how we could perhaps develop it into something that might be useful. So we brought together patients, clinicians, academics, researchers, and we had a very diverse group. So we had a dramatist from the School of Drama, we had a script writer, we had a filmmaker, we had a surgeon, we had our own academics, we had colleagues from the trust. It was great. We started off small, and I don't know how many members have we got today, Claire? Anna would tell me. We have so many. I don't know what, anyway,
I don't know.
30 plus, but they're from, across the world. And in 2017, we were very lucky. We got funding for Claire's PhD. And then in 2018, we also secured some funding for Anna's post. And that has been so instrumental in growing the group and in growing our international reach. Anna is just so passionate about what she does. And as I say, I'm very sorry that she's not here today, because she has just been core to the success of the Renal Arts Group. Okay, thank you, Claire. So what are the aims of the Renal Arts Group? Well, I've been banging on about this. It is about improving quality of life and well-being of people with end-stage kidney disease using arts-based interventions. And if any of you are involved in music, art, knitting, crochet, tapestry, you know that these things can really improve your quality of life. It also gives a voice to patients with kidney disease, and we're also very interested in social impact and public engagement. So how do we increase the knowledge base of the public in relation to end-stage kidney disease? So we do work with the public and have public engagements, and we work very closely with patient charities. We also wanted to produce interdisciplinary work, which I've just discussed. Okay, Claire, thank you. So just some examples of the events and projects. We to begin with, we met as a group, and we just decided to see what come up, what funding arrived, what could we secure, just small amounts of money to get us started. And so we had an event, first of all, at the Ulster Museum back in 2017. When my children were young enough to join. I had a guitar player at home, so he did some lessons for children at the Ulster Museum, and we held that event with the Northern Ireland Kidney Patient Association, and it was just an event to raise our profile, to raise the profile of kidney disease and the profile of the Northern Ireland Kidney Patient Association. It was fun. And then we had a marvellous event at the Sunflower Bar, paid for through the ESRC Festival of Social Science, and I really would recommend this as a way to showcase your research. This happens annually. It's managed through Queen's. You get a small amount of money to run an event. So we had this event in a pub, and we had drinks and we had pizza, and members of the renal arts group performed, and William talked about his life journey. We had a patient who's a photographer show his photography. It was just amazing. There was lots of tears, and it was just so heartfelt and so simple. Then, as many of you know, I'm really interested in mindfulness. I know that mindfulness works from a personal perspective. I also see the evidence base growing. When you take part in an artistic endeavour, you become very mindful. You become, or you move into a state of flow where you are in the moment of whatever it is you're doing. As I say, a piece of music, working on a script, writing some poetry, playing the piano, doing your tapestry, whatever it is, you become immersed, you become mindful. And so mindfulness has become part of our research agenda as well. And so we've had mindfulness at the museum. That was a fantastic event, just free. We were able to make that free of charge. We had patients and carers join us with a member of the museum who took us around, and we looked at these lovely pieces of art and had nice cake and sandwiches, etc. There's always food involved. And then we had a mindful yoga event with the Northern Ireland Kidney Patient Association. And then we got some funding for William a couple of years down the line to enable him to write a script, to develop his script for a performance, his play that he had written. And so he's been working with Shannon Yee on that, and she's been mentoring him through that. So that's just some examples of what we've been doing. Okay, Claire. Oh, so now I've got a little video, and again, this is just another maybe helpful tip. We've been working with a company called Science Animated, and I'm sure that there are very similar companies out there, but I would really highly recommend them. We cost them into all our grant applications, and they help us develop short videos that we embed into our website. So this one is a short introduction to the renal arts group, but we're also working with them on other studies. They also build websites, and it's not that expensive, and the funders have been very supportive of applications that include Science Animated. So I just wanted to let you know that. And we'll play this very short video, which is only 30 seconds, but it's the overview of the renal arts group and why the renal arts group came to fruition. Thank you, Claire. Fingers crossed. Will it not? Oh, will it not work?
I don't think so.
Oh, yeah, usually it's had a little arrow in the middle. Oh, that's a shame. Don't worry. Okay, I'm really sorry. Well, if you go to the Renal Arts Group website, and I'll give you all the information at the end, you will be able to play that video, and it's 30 seconds. And, you know, even just look at it and see if it's something that might be useful for you going forward. actually, what we could do is when I've finished, I'll try and find the link and put it into the chat. Okay, so I'm going to talk then briefly about another project that we secured funding for, and this is the Create and Connect project, and this was the development of online arts-based interventions where we worked with artists, and the premise being that we were trying to support mental health and well-being of people with end-stage kidney disease, particularly during COVID. So if you move on to the next slide, Claire. So it's been really difficult for our patients or patients with end-stage kidney disease and their carers during COVID, because many of our patients are immunocompromised, particularly the transplant patients, but also the patients who are on hemodialysis. And so they had to actually shield, and shield means staying at home and not being in touch with anyone at all, even your family members. And that was for an extended length of time, and many patients really suffered through that period. And so this initiative was about developing some online arts-based activities that would be available virtually and would hopefully support the mental health and well-being of these people who were really in this long extended period of social isolation. So we coordinated these online workshops and tutorials, and we made them available on the website, and we worked with experienced art practitioners, and we had funding to pay them. And so we had a printmaking activity, a creative writing activity, songwriting, blues guitar, and watercolour painting. And we made the activities available once a month between October 2020 and April 21. And they were either delivered live via a Zoom workshop, or they were available to access online. And so I've got an example, but we won't be able to play it, will we, Claire? Oh, it hasn't got the little thing in the middle. Oh, can you? Down the bottom there?
It might work. Let me.
Sticks to it really effectively. And other foliage, the ink doesn't sit so well. So I've coated my foliage with a nice even layer. Again, face down. Now this is where I could use a bit of fabric, so I will. I'll use my little bit of calico here, because I might get a bit of a print on this, so I might give them almost 2 for 1. I do usually just use picture marble for the purposes of this demonstration I'll show you. So again, holding it in place, I'm going to use the spoon. Just going to go over it. And of course, if you're using a printing press, you'd be rolling the foliage and your fabric through the press.
I can't really hear it properly. Can any of you hear it properly?
Again.
Just a little, Helen. I think you have to share the sound as well, but we can see it. It's okay.
Okay, it's nearly done.
Lift it up. Lovely mark on the calico. It's really, really nice.
Okay, so you get the idea. So Claire did Claire, yours was live, wasn't it? You did a live workshop.
I did both. I did a pre-recorded and a live one.
Okay, so Claire's an artist. So was it the skull?
It was the skull, yeah.
Okay, drawing of skulls. So anyway, they're all online, and we've had a lot of interest. Okay, so thinking about measuring impact in terms of these videos that we delivered. So we've had over 1,200 views online, and 91% of our participants have rated the activity as either 4 out of 5 or 5 as being beneficial for their mental well-being. 100% enjoyed the arts activity, and 100% expressed interest in taking part in more activities in the future. So that was a really great response to what we had provided. If you move on, Claire, we also asked people to free text online, and so we've got a lot of qualitative data. I'll just read a couple. The session felt almost therapeutic, getting thoughts out of my head onto paper and being creative. With my hectic family life and uncertainty of the global pandemic, this is wonderful to see and be reminded that art is therapeutic. I'm hoping that drawing will offer a break from life's often fast pace. So we had some really, really positive comments. I feel in a peaceful space. And we also then went on and we did some qualitative interviews with the arts facilitators. Claire, I'll get you to move on. And we thematically analysed those interviews, and we had a number of themes. So I'm just going to talk about three. So one was accessibility, and this quote just illuminates that. It was much more about distilling the activity down to the core components and making it as accessible as possible. So the artists had to really think about how were they going to make this activity online accessible. The impact on health and well-being. Some of the writing might have touched on or brought up some unpleasant memories of trauma or of medical experiences that were unpleasant. It was also a safe space in which people felt a sense of community. And this really did come through, that, you know, it's this safe space doing a creative activity where, yeah, some difficult feelings might arise, but the arts facilitators were able to coordinate that through the medium of art. And then challenges and opportunities for the arts facilitator. Well, a year ago, I would have thought you can't do this, particularly arts and especially music. You just can't do this. I pivoted completely in my views about that. So it was absolutely manageable. Okay, Claire. So then finally, I just want to talk very briefly about our project partners. So we work very carefully with Kidney Care UK. So they're one of the leading patient support charities for kidney patients and their families in the UK. And I think I can safely say here that they've just funded us, and no one knows yet, for a mindfulness study, actually. I just heard last night, they said, keep it hush hush till the letter arrives. So I'm absolutely delighted to announce that here. They've been great supporters of us, and we've worked very closely with them. And, you know, they've got a very big social media follower group, so that's really helpful for us. We also work very closely with Kidney Beam, and that's another fantastic initiative that's about improving well-being through exercise, and it makes available freely to all the nephrology community, including staff, and I've partaken in activities, Pilates, Keep Fit, yoga. It's all free. And they approached us and asked if we would share our arts activities there, because that's all about well-being as well. So all of our activities are shared there and are freely accessible too. So that's really increased our reach. And then we work very closely with the lovely Northern Ireland Kidney Patient Association, which is our local group, and who have worked tirelessly with us from the beginning and promoted all of our activities on Twitter and Facebook, and they've got over 1,900 members. So again, that's been a great resource for us too. So I'm going to now hand over to Claire Carswell, who actually undertook a study in the area, and she's going to talk you through that. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you, Helen. So I'm going to talk about the work that we've been doing, looking at art on hemodialysis specifically. So as Helen's already mentioned, hemodialysis is an incredibly difficult and time-consuming treatment, and she touched on the idea of the existential boredom that patients experience whenever they are receiving this treatment. An existential boredom is essentially a state of mind where you are so profoundly bored that you can't help but focus on the passage of time. And because you're focusing on the passage of time, you start to think about things like illness and mortality. And for patients on hemodialysis who are receiving a life-sustaining treatment in a highly specialised clinical area and have an end-stage disease, they're already primed to be having those sort of intrusive thoughts about illness and death. As a result, there are high rates of depression and anxiety. A cross-sectional study by Kikoski et al. Found that 78.5% of the patients that they sampled had met the diagnostic criteria for some form of depressive disorder, ranging from dysthymia to a major depressive episode. And the general prevalence of depression for most of the literature is about 20 to 50% of the hemodialysis population, which is a staggeringly high amount, but we've very little to offer in terms of treatment or interventions to support them. And art might actually ideally be place to address this specific issue of depression and existential boredom on hemodialysis because of the other theory that Helen mentioned, which is the theory of flow. So flow is a theory developed by the positive psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, which describes a state of optimal experience. It's whenever you're completely engaged in an activity, and because of that, you're not paying attention to anything around you, you're not attending to the thoughts in your head, and you also experience something called tachypsychia, which is an altered perception of time. So most typically, people experience time passing a lot quicker than it actually is. And for patients on hemodialysis who, for them, the time is dragging in and they're watching the clock count down, that's actually very beneficial. So this idea then led to the funding for the PhD project that I undertook, and that looked at the feasibility of bringing art into a hemodialysis unit, because again, it's a very clinical area, but also to look at the feasibility of evaluating it within a randomized control trial framework. Now, the first sort of step for this study was developing the arts-based intervention itself. This was done using Daisy Fancourt's framework for developing arts and health interventions, and it involved firstly establishing an interdisciplinary advisory group. This consisted of patients, healthcare professionals, artists, academics, and sort of other people who had ties to the renal world and the arts world. And we met every so often to discuss the intervention development. We also identified a theoretical framework, which was the theory of flow, and we did a few evidence synthesis and systematic reviews, and we also I also was able to shadow artists in residence and patients and healthcare professionals on a number of occasions. The intervention that we arrived at involved 6 one-hour-long, one-to-one facilitated art sessions at the patient's bedside during hemodialysis. This happened twice a week over a period of 3 weeks. Each participant got their own individual art pack to help reduce the risk of cross-contamination and to work within infection control protocols. Participants could choose between either visual arts or creative writing, and they could choose between different types of creative writing and different types of visual art. And each session had a focus on skill development, because in order to induce a flow state, you have to be engaging in an activity that is challenging, but you also have to develop the skills to meet that challenge. Now, the feasibility study involved recruiting patients to take part in this intervention, and they were randomly allocated to either the intervention group or a waiting list control group who only received the intervention after the study had finished. And we did collect some outcome data as part of the pilot study, and we conducted interviews with healthcare professionals and patients to explore their experience of the intervention and their experience of the trial processes as well. Now, the feasibility study was very successful, and it demonstrated that both the intervention and the larger trial are feasible and acceptable. Now, a lot of our findings did relate to the methodology, and they're going to inform the design of a larger randomized controlled trial, but some of the findings instead were also focused on the intervention and how it was being delivered, and this has informed our work since then, separate to the research focus side of it. In general, participants said that they enjoyed the intervention, that it improved their well-being and improved their self-esteem, it made them more sociable, and they really enjoyed it. But 2 specific things related to what we've decided to do since in terms of developing impact as a result of this feasibility study. And those 2 findings were to do with the length of the intervention and the importance of facilitation, so having a facilitator there. In terms of the length of the intervention, participants wanted it to be longer. They wanted it to be much longer. They wanted a lot more sessions, and they wanted the sessions themselves to be longer than 1 hour. Now, this has a lot of implications going forward, because the general consensus was that they wanted this to be available indefinitely. They didn't want a time limit put on it. They just wanted it to be available to them at all times. And they didn't want a one-off intervention. And interestingly, so did healthcare professionals. They wanted this available at all times too. So this impacts how we can implement this going forward in terms of practice. The second important finding was the importance of the facilitator. The facilitator was really essential to actually resulting in the positive outcomes and the benefits that patients were experiencing, and for some patients also their ability to engage in it full stop. Now, I was the facilitator as part of my PhD, and that in itself also has implications going forward, because even though I've done a few bits and pieces of arts with like arts activities and work with Helen and the Renal Arts Group, I'm not a professional artist. I'm not trained as an artist. I don't have a degree in art, and I didn't really pick up art properly outside of school until I started this PhD. So I was an amateur whenever I was doing this, and I still am an amateur. It's a hobby. But what we found was that patients can engage very well, and they can find numerous benefits from taking part in an intervention that is facilitated by an amateur. So we don't necessarily need a professional artist to be delivering these sort of activities on hemodialysis. So what that has sort of resulted in is this idea that we can implement this long-term without professionals. So once the study was finished, patients and healthcare professionals who'd previously never experienced art in health or art on their unit, they wanted it back. So we came up with this idea going forward that we would develop a guideline to actually deliver this sort of intervention on a more sustainable basis using volunteers, so that this could go into practice a lot quicker than what we would need in terms of doing a large randomized control trial and getting funding and commissioned. So we applied for funding from the ESRC Impact Acceleration Account to develop guidelines to deliver the arts-based intervention in hemodialysis using volunteers. And we were able to get that funding in, I think it was February or January, February of 2020. So we developed the guidance with input from key stakeholders. The Northern Health and Social Care Trust was the site where we'd actually done the original feasibility study, but they were attached to this project from the conception of it. So they were a huge source of support. We also worked mainly with the renal unit at Antrim Area Hospital and also with the community wellbeing team within the Northern Health and Social Care Trust. We had members of the Renal Arts Group attending the advisory meetings, and we also had input from the Northern Ireland Kidney Patient Association and Kidney Care UK. Now, these stakeholders all made up the core sort of advisory group for the development of the guidance. And we would meet about every month or so, depending on what was happening with the pandemic, to identify what we needed to cover in these guidelines to ensure that the volunteer programme could be set up, what information trusts would need in order to, recruit volunteers, support volunteers and train volunteers. And the advisory group also reviewed drafts of the guidelines over the several months that we were working on them. And then the final step of the development of these guidelines was a workshop to refine the guidance, and that included additional key stakeholders from across the UK. So we had a number of different patient advocates from Kidney Care UK from both England and Scotland, and we also had representatives from May We, which is an arts and health charity that the Northern Health and Social Care Trust were working with at that moment in time. And then just to say quickly that we haven't done this yet, but we do plan to disseminate the guidelines, again with Science Animated, who Helen's already talked about. We have started working with them to develop an animation and an infographic to launch the guidelines. We'd originally wanted to hold an event, obviously, but then the pandemic changed a lot of our plans. So this instead is what we're doing to launch the guidelines, which will hopefully be launched in the next few months. Now, I just want to give you a bit of an idea about what the guidelines actually had to cover whenever we were in the process of developing them, and what we had to consider and how we addressed any issues that came up. And the first thing that I need to mention is the fact that the pandemic had a huge impact on this guidance and this project in general. So we really started to meet up and get the ball rolling on this project at the start of March in 2020. So within a month, we were locked down, and we realized that we weren't going to be able to deliver the project in the way that we'd originally planned. So we had two choices going forward. The first was going to be either assume that the pandemic was going to pass and just write the guidelines as if there was no pandemic and as if we didn't have to take into account enhanced infection control procedures and things like that. And I mean, the pandemic should end at some point, but we didn't know how long that was going to take. The second option then was to acknowledge the fact that we were living within a pandemic and that we would like this to be delivered and implemented as soon as possible, and account for that in our guidelines by sort of developing a way that we could actually do these sort of volunteer delivered activities within the restrictions of a pandemic. And we went for option 2. And as a result, we have developed a guideline that outlines both how you would do it in an ideal world, so directly providing the arts-based intervention, but also how you would do it if, you know, we're in the midst of a wave of the COVID pandemic. So in terms of remote provision is essentially would mean that the volunteer wouldn't be able to enter the hemodialysis unit, and because people haven't been able to go onto the hemodialysis unit during the pandemic, apart from the patients and the healthcare professionals working there. Participants would still receive their own arts pack, and the only issue would be that there would be no bedside facilitation, so that would definitely limit accessibility. Participants would need to be approached and recruited into the activities by healthcare professionals because they would be the only people having face-to-face contact. And there would be facilitation, but it wouldn't be at the bedside. Instead, it would be done remotely, ideally through video calls. And then we also wanted to use the tutorials that Helen's already talked about to sort of act as an additional resource for patients who are participating in these activities. Direct provision then is basically the same as what we did during the feasibility study. So there would be bedside facilitation, participants would receive their own arts pack, and patients would be invited to participate by the volunteer themselves because they would be able to go onto the unit and talk about the activities. The benefit of this would be that it's a lot more accessible. So patients who have arteriovenous fistulas, who aren't able to move their arm, for example, during hemodialysis, are more likely to be able to engage in direct provision because they have the practical support of the facilitator at their bedside. So that's sort of the strategy that we came up with to address the COVID pandemic in the actual delivery of the intervention. In terms of the volunteering side of things, one important aspect of setting up the volunteer role was actually defining what the role was. So for our guidelines, we use the guidance, the description of an activity volunteer that the Northern Health and Social Care Trust use. And this volunteer role is described as assisting staff with activities such as arts, crafts and music that will support service users in the development of their own health and well-being. So this volunteer role fits very nicely in terms of our idea of what our volunteers would be doing, but we have highlighted in the guidance that this is likely to differ from trust to trust. We also highlight in the guidance the fact that we don't need to be recruiting professional artists. What we need is an enthusiastic amateur. We need someone who has experience to some degree of art, but most importantly, they need to have good interpersonal skills. They need to be able to support patients, because art can be a little bit anxiety inducing at times, and that needs to be rectified. The next thing that we needed to take into consideration was training. So for the Northern Health and Social Care Trust, they have a standardized set of training that is part of their induction for all volunteers. So this would include things like an introduction to the trust, the values of the trust, safeguarding, infection prevention and control, fire safety, information governance, and the roles and the responsibilities of the volunteer position. Now, some of those are going to be appropriate for direct provision, and some of those aren't going to be appropriate for remote provision. Things like fire safety might be less of an issue if you're only seeing patients over a video call. But we also thought through the advisory group and also through the workshop that we do need some more enhanced training for these volunteers. In particular, a little bit of training about the arts-based intervention itself would be beneficial. It's not exactly telling people how to do the activities, but teaching people about the theory that underpins the intervention, because that informs how patients can be approached and how you can support them to sort of gain their confidence whenever they're engaging in art. Secondly, something that was very much highlighted in the workshop was that we do need some enhanced training around hemodialysis and kidney disease itself, because if we're not recruiting people who have experience of kidney disease, they're not going to be familiar with it. They're not going to be familiar with the hemodialysis setting, and they might not be aware of just how unwell and how frail the patients that they're working with could be. So we thought that was important, both for preparing the volunteers to go in, but also just so that they know what they're getting into and to support their own well-being. And then finally, supervision. So volunteers in general need supervision, no matter what the volunteer role is. And we were trying to think about who was best placed to supervise our volunteers for within the guidelines. And it's actually different between direct and remote provision. So with direct provision, because the volunteer is coming onto the unit and working at a patient's bedside, it's important that their supervisor is a healthcare professional who's a member of the renal team, because they will be working within a clinical setting. However, with remote provision, because the volunteer won't actually be coming onto the unit and they won't be working within that setting, they don't necessarily need that type of supervision. That's not where their biggest support needs are going to be. And because of that, we've written into the guideline that if you're doing remote provision, you can source who you think is the best placed person to supervise the volunteer. So for example, it could be an artist in residence working within the trust who might be more able to address some of the concerns the volunteer would have about the arts activities and guiding participants remotely about the arts activities compared to navigating the clinical setting. So I just want to very quickly say a massive thank you to the Economic and Social Research Council for funding this project, and also a huge thank you to the Northern Health and Social Care Trust, especially Antrim Area Hospital's Renal Unit and the Community Wellbeing team, because they have been phenomenal during this this project, and the Community Wellbeing team is actually taking this on and trying to implement these sort of guidelines within the trust. At the moment, they're working with a few arts and health charities to do that. So that's amazing. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. Yeah, so just to say, in September, we are hoping or planning to submit our NIHR application for a multi-centred RCT, cluster RCT, and it's taken us 6 years from that first point where William handed me his poetry to this point where we're ready to submit. So it's just, I suppose, an example of a project that just started small and has continued because of the passion of the group, and it's been an amazing journey, hasn't it, Claire? It really has. And also we feel there's such a spark of interest nationally. The people we talk to, we're talking to potential PIs and nephrologists in units, they're really keen. They hear about the other things we're interested in, they say, I don't know that'll work, but when you say art, they're yeah, we'd be really interested in that. So it's great, it's really great to see. Okay, are there some points coming in?
Okay, if I stop recording now and we open up in the discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Linda. Yeah, goodbye.